They were built by the ancients in a time before Christ, to a scale that's unbelievable. They dared their creators to push engineering to new heights, which still astound us today. Architecture and sculpture continue to stand in the shadow of their genius. Now, by revealing the secrets of the past, we can unlock the mysteries of their construction, which earned them the highest distinction as the Seven Wonders of the Ancient World. The Great Pyramid is the only survivor of the seven ancient wonders, the finest monuments of all time. The others have fallen, taking with them the secrets of their history and construction. They laid the foundations of human achievement, becoming the building blocks of modern architecture and sculpture. From the world's largest pyramid to the very first skyscraper, the seven ancient wonders were all massive construction projects. They challenged their creators to conquer the scale of their ambitions.
The seven ancient wonders are a great example of how people build to impress, build to a scale which seems almost incredible, almost as if they were intending to make people look at them and say, well, could this have been possible?
To solve nearly insurmountable construction problems, visionary architects were forced to conquer the unknown with extraordinary results. There were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, built high above ground, displaying their color in the middle of a desert.
I'm most intrigued by the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I wish it was still there. Of all the seven wonders, that is the one I wish had not been destroyed. It's so unusual. It excites one's imagination.
Exotic and mysterious, they have enchanted us through the ages. Standing upon an arid plain, how were the Babylonians able to conceive them? The ancient gardeners had a great knowledge of horticulture, but what plants were they able to grow in the Hanging Gardens? The first cranes were used to construct the world's largest marble temple. It was supported by a forest of fluted columns 60 feet high. How were the ancients able to achieve such detail while working on such an enormous scale? Using simple techniques, they overcame the most difficult problems. Solid marble lintels weighing 40 tons were lowered with hair's breadth precision.
It was one of the examples of the ways in which these early Greek architects were responding to the desire to build huge edifices with huge blocks of stone and needing new technologies to cope with it.
An ingenious technique was used to create the finest sculpture of all time, the giant statue of Zeus, lifelike in every detail. How was it possible to create a statue of ivory taller than a 4-story building?
The overwhelming flash and brilliance of all the materials at that scale is something we can only imagine in our minds.
The sculptor who created it used a secret recipe to shape the ivory. But how did he achieve such realism? The originality of its design has inspired artists and sculptors to copy it throughout the centuries. The Pharos, a lighthouse, was the world's first skyscraper standing over 400 feet high. How were the ancients able to build so high without modern equipment? The Pharos blasted its golden light 50 miles out to sea. What mechanism could cast a beam so far? For centuries, the secrets of its construction lay hidden beneath the sea.
So we are on the place here, on the underwater site.
Now, a marine archaeologist and his team are recovering its remains from the sea floor to discover how the Pharos once stood. The 7 ancient wonders created the building technologies of today.
It was the invention of the crane by the ancients that enabled them, and now us, to lift heavy weights high onto a building.
The ancients dared to build high. Until little more than a century ago, the Great Pyramid remained the tallest structure on Earth. Only with modern engineering have we mastered the technology to build higher, giving rise to our finest skyscrapers and even buildings made out of glass.
One thing I learned to respect the Egyptians is the proportion of that pyramid. The Egyptians were right 4,000 years ago.
The ancient builders took risks to attempt the impossible. Now, nothing is left to chance.
The computer has allowed us to test designs that before we couldn't have tested, and that's given us the confidence to actually proceed with these designs and be daring. A good example of an early use of the computer was Sydney Opera House, which was a very unusual structure.
Today's creations stretch to the heavens, but their foundations are embedded deep in the past. They rest upon the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which still challenge and amaze us after thousands of years. Their origins lie in the ancient Greek world. Although all 7 wonders lay inside the Greek Empire, only one stood within mainland Greece. In the 5th century BC, Greece was invaded by Persian armies. By 480 BC, the Persians had taken Athens, destroying much of the city. But the Greeks fought back and defeated the Persians. Within 10 years, the statesman Pericles came to power. Athens was rich from the spoils of war. Pericles commissioned monuments glorifying its victory, including a new temple to the goddess Athena, the Parthenon. It was decorated with lavish friezes. The most famous are known today as the Elgin marbles. The finest Greek sculptors worked on the Parthenon. Pericles was so impressed with one in particular, named Phidias, that he made him the chief designer. Phidias would become the Michelangelo of the Greek age. Phidias was asked to make a statue of the goddess Athena to stand inside the Parthenon. Crafted from ivory and gold, he designed it to stand 40 feet high. Statues and monuments were being commissioned across the country, and artistic rivalry was intense. Phidias was determined that his Athena would outshine every other statue in Greece.
Phidias' great achievement was to meet this challenge, and after he made the Athena, virtually every other Greek town wanted such a statue.
Phidias was heralded as a genius, but his name became blackened by scandal. On completing the Athena, he was unable to account for all the gold he had used. Phidias was accused of embezzlement by those eager to bring down his powerful patron. Fortunately for Phidias, news of his spectacular Athena had traveled to Olympia. He was now commissioned to make a statue of Zeus to stand inside the temple there. So, in 438 BC, to escape the scandal in Athens, Phidias left for Olympia. The site of the Olympic Games was dominated by a temple. It awaited Phidias' masterpiece. The Olympic Games attracted competitors from all over the Greek world. Wars stopped when the games were held in honor of Zeus, the supreme god. Phidias arrived in Olympia to take up his new commission. With his reputation on the line, he approached the great temple.
So it seems that the Eleans, having seen or heard about what was up in Athens, decided, we want one of those too, and we want Phidias to make it for us. And they went and they commissioned him to do that.
Until Phidias, ivory carving had only been executed on a small scale. Phidias designed the Zeus to be taller than a 4-story building. It would fill one end of the temple. It was too large to be carved out of solid blocks of ivory. So he developed a technique which has never been surpassed.
The structure of ivory is such that you can unscroll it. You have to imagine it as if you're unpeeling an onion or putting a pencil in an old manual pencil sharpener and turning it, and you get a thin, narrow shaving strip of ivory. And no one had tried to do this before, and that's really what was original.
Phidias developed a secret method for softening the ivory. Only a few ancient recipes survive. Professor Kenneth Lapatin is the first to have rediscovered them.
Some seem to be a bit fantastic, like wrapping them in fish skin, which I have never tried to do. Others say boil 3 days with mandrake root, which seemed a bit dangerous to try. Others said soak in oil, which did nothing for me. But one said soak in vinegar, which I did do, and that produced results. And what happens is that the ivory, which is tooth, it's largely calcium, has some of its chemical components leached out of it, and it becomes soft and flexible. And then you can mold it to shape and dry it out, and it will maintain that shape. And it was Phidias' genius that assembled these techniques from various different crafts to make this wonder of the world.
Phidias and his assistants painstakingly followed this technique of shaping every detail. Every ivory section was made to fit exactly. The Zeus began as a wooden framework. To this, the molded ivory sections were fastened. The statue was built up, piece by piece, to a height of 45 feet. It took over 7 years before Phidias was satisfied everything was perfect. The Zeus was then assembled inside the temple.
It had a great reputation, but none of that really prepared you for that shock when you walked through the temple doors and saw the image. Unlike, I think, all of the other wonders, you couldn't see it from afar. You had to go and enter the temple, and then it hit you all at once. Oh, gee, that really is big. Wow.
The writer Strabo, in the 1st century AD, was critical of its revolutionary composition.
The sculptor may be criticized for not having appreciated the correct proportions. He has shown Zeus seated, so we have the impression that if Zeus moved to stand up, he would unroof the temple.
The Zeus sits still. He's holding his emblems of power, the victory in his right hand, the scepter in his left. But he's not doing anything. The stilling of the god gives him greater power because there's the potential there for action. He's very aware. And it's that calmness that becomes a hallmark of the classical style.
Characteristics of Phidias' world wonder are echoed throughout Western art. From Byzantine images of Christ to 20th century statues of American presidents. In 1914, Daniel Chester French began work on the Lincoln Memorial statue. Using the same composition as the Zeus, Daniel French made the Lincoln statue out of 28 pieces of marble. Phidias had been meticulous in his study of light, but Daniel French discovered on a dull day his sculpture looked flat. He had to install an elaborate lighting setup. The scale of his sculpture was also criticized, this time for being too small. Daniel French had to double its dimensions to satisfy his commissioners. Even then, the Lincoln statue was only half the height of Phidias's Zeus. Over 450 years after Phidias's world wonder was made, Roman soldiers and workmen arrived with special orders from the Emperor Caligula. He had instructed them to bring the statue back to Rome, so he could put his own head on it. Legend recalls the statue let out such a loud cackle of laughter. The scaffolding collapsed and the workmen fled. Luckily for them, the ruthless emperor was assassinated before they returned to Rome, empty-handed. By 391 AD, the Christian church banned pagan cults and closed the temples. The Olympic Games ceased, and the great sanctuary of Olympia fell into disrepair. When the Zeus was 800 years old, it was bought up by Luasus, an imperial chamberlain from Constantinople, and installed in his palace art collection there. Phidias's world wonder would not survive for long. A fire destroyed the palace and the collection, cremating the finest statue of all time. The influence of Greek art and architecture spread into Persia, an enemy of Greece. At the western tip of the Persian Empire lay the once great city of Halicarnassus. It is now the small resort of Bodrum, lying in present-day Turkey. At first, it appears an unlikely site for a world wonder. But in the 4th century BC, this was the capital of a powerful sea empire. Inland from the harbor lie the ruins of a tomb, the most extraordinary building ever constructed. It stood the height of a 14-story building, combined an assortment of styles, and was covered with statues. It has left us the word mausoleum, used to describe monumental tombs ever since. Its style has been copied around the world, from the Freemasons' Lodge in Washington, D.C., to the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, Australia. The creation of this incredible structure was down to the vision of one of history's little-known yet extraordinary figures, King Mausolus. A Persian governor, or satrap, he became king of this area, known as Caria. Mausolus's unusual behavior included marrying one of his sisters, Artemisia. Erratic and headstrong, he founded a dynasty upon tyrannical control.
Mausolus married his elder sister Artemisia, which is a very curious thing to do because brother-sister marriage does not seem to have existed in the family before his generation.
From the day he became king in 377 BC, Mausolus fiercely protected his kingdom. The ruins of the Mindus Gate are all that remain of his grand defensive walls, which stretched for 7 miles around the city. He also built up a navy of 100 ships.
In the Persian tradition, he had a fortress palace, which is believed to have occupied the site currently where the castle is. Mausolus is obviously a very powerful, dominant figure, successful politically and victorious in war.
His forces stood poised to repel any Greek attack. Yet Mausolus openly welcomed Greek culture. Deluded by visions of his own grandeur, he planned the construction of a vast tomb. He chose a Greek architect to design it. His name was Pythias. He was unknown and unconventional.
We don't know exactly where he came from, but he was very much a pioneering theoretical architect, probably the most important theoretical architect of the 4th century BC. He had very strong views on what was appropriate in architectural design and what was not.
The Persians had a tradition of building tombs. Mausolus followed the example of the Persian king Cyrus the Great. But Mausolus's tomb would be far grander. Pythias designed for him an extraordinary building. It defied the conventional styles of the day. Apart from the Great Pyramid, it stood twice the height of any known building in the Western world, 14 stories high. The tomb would be unique. It would incorporate different styles from different countries. On the top, and never attempted before in architecture, a vast statue. Below, a stepped roof, inspired by the Egyptian pyramids. Beneath were Greek columns from temple architecture. Under these, giant statues resembling friezes, another architectural innovation. At the base was a tomb chamber. This alone used over 12,000 tons of stone. Mausolus gave orders for his tomb to be built on top of an existing royal burial site. Because of the scale of the tomb, this choice of location presented problems. The mausoleum needed foundations dug to a depth of 20 feet. They soon flooded. Having drained them, Pythias increased stability by joining the masonry together. Iron clamps, or dovetails, were used to secure each block to the next, and dowels were fitted between the courses. To assemble the columns, a hole was cut in the base of each, allowing iron connecting bars to join onto the next section. This technique is still used today.
These blocks have been banded together so that they get strength from each other. The ancients also realized that for stone blocks to share the weight more effectively, particularly on a large structure, they needed to be clamped or doweled together. If there was a weakness in the foundation, for example, then the building could cope with it better.
The mausoleum became a world wonder because of the statues adorning it, over twice life-size. These heroic figures stood high up on ledges and weighed many tons.
By the time that the mausoleum is being built, great strides have been made in the development of cranes and siege engines, massive timber constructions on wheels capable of lifting dead weights to a height of 140 feet.
We take it for granted that we can use machinery to help us on our construction sites. This beam weighs about 1.5 tons. It was the invention of the crane by the ancients that enabled them, and now us, to lift heavy weights high onto a building quickly and with great precision.
The heaviest statue sat on the very top of the mausoleum. It was an enormous sculpture of Mausolus and Artemisia in a chariot, pulled by 4 horses. This revolutionary idea of putting a statue on the top of a building has been copied since in triumphal arches and monuments. Mausolus never saw his completed tomb. He died in 352 BC. His body was interred within the mausoleum. But Artemisia, his sister and widow, would prove to be more formidable than Mausolus himself. After the death of Mausolus, Artemisia became queen. Her rise to power was unprecedented in the Western world. she continued to oversee the construction of the tomb. Throughout her short reign, she demonstrated her strength. Her bravery in war led the Persian king Xerxes to exclaim that his men had become women and his women men.
There is the famous story that the Rhodians decided to attack Halicarnassus after the death of Mausolus, when Artemisia was in control, thinking presumably they could easily overthrow a feeble woman. But she outwitted them and in fact captured them, and then returned to Rhodes with the Halicarnassian fleet and captured Rhodes.
Although she appeared to be invincible, her brother's death had weakened her spirit. Her decline was so tragic it was later romanticized by Renaissance artists.
She seems to have been completely besotted with her elder brother, to the extent that even after his death she is supposed to have mixed some of the ashes of his remains with her wine and drunk it. Possibly this is one reason why she didn't outlive him by many years.
Artemisia ruled for just 2 years before she died. She was interred alongside Mausolus, her brother and husband. They were carried away to the next world in their chariot. The mausoleum was finally finished after Artemisia's death. Her younger brother and sister also married before the dynasty died out. The mausoleum remained an object of admiration until the 15th century, when an earthquake destroyed much of it. The stone blocks were used for rebuilding the castle of St. John in the harbor. Most of the statues, which had made the mausoleum a world wonder, were thrown into lime kilns to make cement. "100 miles up the Persian coast from Halicarnassus stood the largest marble temple ever constructed. It had been built at Ephesus, the wealthiest city in Asia Minor and the largest port on the Aegean. The temple, dedicated to the goddess Artemis, attracted pilgrims who flocked here to visit her cult shrine. Artemis was a mother goddess, her many breasts symbolizing the fertility of women. King Croesus, renowned for his wealth, financed the building of a temple to her in 550 BC. The architect chosen to build it was Chersiphron. Although he was highly trained in temple construction, this commission was on a scale never before attempted.
One of the interesting things about temples such as the Temple at Ephesus are that they are among the earliest works of Greek architecture on any real scale.
Chersiphron may well have visited the temples of Thebes in Egypt and been inspired by the forests of columns there. His temple of Artemis would be built entirely from marble and have 126 giant columns. Chersiphron's first challenge was to ensure a constant supply of enormous blocks of marble. The quarries were 7 miles from the construction site, and some marble blocks could weigh as much as 40 tons. Engineer Scott Steedman has examined the difficulties of moving them.
There's a lot of controversy about how the ancients moved heavy stones. We know that they dragged them, of course, but when you drag a stone, you have to overcome a huge amount of friction from the weight of the stone on its runners underneath. So if you want a system that doesn't involve dragging, then you may be able to rock them, or even to roll them. This is a mock-up of a rocking device where the stone is strapped in between 2 large wooden rockers. This is a very efficient system of overcoming friction, and you can see just how easy it is to move even a heavy object. You could maneuver it, you could spin it, you could pull it up a ramp, with considerably fewer men than if you were trying to drag it.
Chersiphron's methods of moving stone were highly advanced. He invented an ingenious roller pulled by oxen.
The circular column elements were simply rolled along the ground within a frame pulled by oxen. But the rectangular elements were, of course, a rather more difficult proposition, and some of these were enormous. I mean, the largest of the architraves was nearly 9 meters long, which is an enormous block of stone. And to move that, he encased the ends in timberwork and turned them into wheels, and then simply attached draft animals to them and pulled them along.
The temple measured a vast 180 by 360 feet, almost twice the size of the Parthenon. It was surrounded by a double row of columns, 60 feet high. One of the biggest problems was lifting up the giant lintels to the column tops.
Stones like these weigh as much as 5 to 10 tons apiece. So how did the ancient Greeks lift such enormous weights to the top of a temple? We know that in ancient Egypt they used a form of cantilever crane called a shaduf to lift water. And we know that the ancient Greeks used the same principle, but on a much larger scale, to lift weights at the dockside, cargo and even ships. So we can imagine that it's entirely possible that they used the same type of cantilever crane inside the temple, perhaps mounted on a mound of earth and stone, so that they could build up a platform halfway up the temple to give them the leverage they would need to reach right to the top.
Unlike earlier civilizations, Chersiphron's